The world in which we live is showing the strain of an utter irrationalism and its political outlook, as we find not only with Khomeini, and he, I would add, is a good subject for discussion, but with the tangled situation in regard to Afghanistan, Iraq, and I don't know whether you heard the announcement today or not. I've spent the day with my daughter, having spoken for her group, a Sunday school class, and a lot of others last night at her home. Today, Red China announced that it is aiding and sending supplies and allegedly troops to Afghanistan to aid them in their fight against Russia. Now, I'm not trying to be a prophet to tell you what that means because, frankly, I don't know. But I have been told by competent observers that there's a tremendous strain between Red China and Communist Russia, and that communism cannot, as a philosophy, cannot overcome the traditional and the historic ethnic conflict between the Slavic Russians and the Chinese. The Chinese, rightly or wrongly, have always felt that they're much more cultured than the Russians, and I suspect they had considerable reason for feeling that way. And while the Red Chinese did conquer them in 1948-49, they did set the People's Republic. There has not been that unanimity of outlook which Soviet Russia has sought to impose upon Red China. And as a result today, the Red Chinese have become very restive. You know, there's been a border conflict between the Chinese on northwest borders and Soviet Russia. And the creation of Red China did nothing to alleviate that particular problem. I would not want to say what will happen. I don't mean to take time off in the course, but what you are seeing today is most applicable to what I've been teaching you in this course and what I shall continue to teach you. The descent into the abyss of irrationalism. So that what is going on today almost defies a rationale for interpretation. Poor Mr. Carter's dealing with an irrational person, and Ayatollah Khomeini. At the bottom of 43, I think we ought to discuss something. In the practical area, in the realm of ethics and freedom, Descartes, in discussing and treating of the free will of man, departed from the biblical position and held to an essentially Greek concept of ethical freedom. Note, for him, human evil was the result of what? Human imperfection. To what does that hearken? Plato. That knowledge is virtue, therefore the lack of knowledge is what? The lack of virtue. An imperfection which results of man's finite nature, and thus he can and does err. But evil results from the failure of the will and the impulse of man to operate within the area of understanding and of the intellect or the mind of man. Now, do you see what Descartes is saying? There's a dichotomy between what man knows and what man wills. Evil is the insistence of the will upon action without due reflection, without due thought. In other words, if you think correctly, you will always act correctly. Now, note, I did not say, and I did not imply, that this country is totally blank. I'm not saying all people have lost their senses. I'm not saying all people fail to see. I'm not saying it at all. But there's a dichotomy between many, how many I don't know, but many individuals who are seeing this, and shall we say the official direction of the national government, the official direction of education, the official direction of the mainline denominations. There is a dichotomy between what people say. The failure of the will. In other words, what Descartes is saying, if the will of man would always operate within the area of the understanding, the intellect, and the mind, there'd be no problem. But the will of man deviates from that.
In a way, I see that Paul says somewhat the same thing. He says, I will that I would do the right, but I do the wrong.
Yeah, but you see, and now...
he's saying if you knew...
You do it. That's right. And now you see, here's the next point where he deviates tremendously from Paul. Nevertheless, in spite of his finite limitation, which limits his actions, of course, man is naturally inclined to follow the good, even as his reason is naturally directed toward the truth. Because the will is naturally inclined to the good, and the mind is naturally inclined toward what? The truth. He denies the biblical doctrine of tova pratis. He denies the biblical doctrine of sin, and we need to remember that. Thus, his views of freedom, his views of ethics, his view of matter, his view of reality, his view of man, his view of God, are all defective. Now, notice, when men follow the dictates of nature given to them by God, they are in perfect freedom. That is an old Stoic doctrine. However, note the great difficulty, and I'll have to explain this to you. And a great difficulty emerges at this point. There is in Descartes' total philosophy a mechanistic element, which is totally devoid of any theological and teleological character. Now, this mechanistic element, by its very nature, must rule out any possibility of the operation of divine providence. For Descartes, there was a tremendous problem in the union or the interaction of mind and matter. Now, if this is true on the finite human level, it's also true in regard to God and man. How does God operate upon man? Descartes basically introduced a mechanism. A mechanistic view of life is that view which holds that man is totally subject to fate and to the operations of natural law, or to the operations of natural law. That's very popular, has been right through history. How many people say, well, fate brought this to me. I was moved by fate, or fate has overtaken me, and my fate is this, that, and the other thing. Oh. In spite of the fact that Descartes, I would believe in a personal God, at least on Sunday. In his philosophy, there's no room for personal God. Thus, Descartes represents covenant breaking. He represents a non-Christian view of God, man, and the world. If you mean by that, did he go to church? The answer is yes. Did he take the Eucharist, go to Mass? Did he go to confession? The answer is yes. But if you mean by that, did he have a Christian world and life view? The answer is no. Now, I refuse to judge a man's soul. I am not saying that he did not believe. I would have serious questions about it. But no man can be the ultimate judge of Descartes' destiny. I would say this, his philosophy is almost totally anti-Christian. I know he went to church. I know he'd been trained by the Jesuits. He knew Roman Catholic doctrine. But in his philosophy, he rejected a great deal of St. Thomas. He rejected a great deal of scriptures, not in the sense I don't believe them, and in the sense he just pushed them aside and plowed ahead with his own philosophy. And he did deny divine providence. When you deny the providential governance of the world by a personal, sovereign God, you are, in the name of freedom, plunging man into the maelstrom of determination. May I make this observation the rest of the book? This is one of the principal elements of this quote. You are only free when you are totally a slave to Jesus Christ. Paul used the word doulos again and again in the introduction to his epistle, which is the Greek word for slave. Remember what Augustine said, that man is totally free, that man is most free, who is most subject to Jesus Christ. Now, what does he mean by that? When we are, the more sanctified we are, the more we're subject to the will of Jesus Christ, in him is perfect freedom. So the more we approach Christ, the more free we are. Determinism holds that man is subject to impersonal forces beyond himself. Generally speaking, Shelley, beginning with the Stoics and the Greeks, but particularly with the Stoics, and in modern philosophy, with deists and allied groups and the materialists, and of course the Marxians, beginning with Marx in the 19th century. The determinism has taken either the route of saying that man is determined by the forces of nature, which was the deistic route, and others, or man is totally determined by his economic environment, which is the Marxian form of determinism. Others hold, like B.F. Skinner, that man is determined by his social environment. But all non-Christian belief, in one way or another, is deterministic element. When man rebels against the doctrine of divine providence and rejects it, he plunges himself into the worst type of servitude. Now let me make one other statement, and then I shall go on to the text. Today we're confronted in the political realm with despotism, not merely that of Khomeini or that of Brezhnev and Stalin and Khrushchev and so on. not merely with Hitler, not merely with Mussolini. We're confronted with that. Students, we're confronted with in our own country. There's a growing despotism in this country. There's a growing totalitarianism in this country. And it stems from modern humanism, as well as Marxian philosophy. Because modern humanism, existentialism, Marxianism, socialism, let me boil it down, all forms of liberalism, all forms of liberal philosophy, whether it be social philosophy, political philosophy, economic philosophy, educational philosophy, psychological outlooks, all forms of liberalism breed despotism. They breed totalitarianism. And wherever you have liberalism, you will find hard in its wake. There is a desire, make no mistake about the people behind what's happening. They want it. They have goals. They know exactly what they want. They're using the schools. They're trying to bend the church, and they've bent much of the church. They're bending all types of institutions. They're using all areas of the federal government. One of the forms is energy conservation. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't use energy wisely, but some of the energy measures have no relationship to saving energy. They are designed to promote a totalitarian dictatorship. The employment practices, what you can teach in school, busing is one segment of it. I mean, if you want an irrational approach to education, that's it. Nobody profits from busing except the people who build the buses. Now, I'm not saying, because I would be probably attributing too much mental power to him, that Carter is a ringleader in this. As in my investigation, I've identified Mr. Carter is a pawn. He's being used and used badly. I'm not attributing vicious issues to him. I really don't think so, but I do think, in fact, I know that he was picked in 1972 because he could be used. I know the many, I don't know him personally, but I know who picked him. From Descartes to Spinoza to Leibniz to Locke and so on, what do you see? You see a steady drift away from any biblical element, ingredient in modern philosophy, and the steady drift toward totalitarianism. Now, in the earlier days, the philosopher did not openly deny Christianity. I'm speaking specifically of Descartes. Now, Spinoza was a Jew. He was so unorthodox as a Jew that he was read out of the temple in the Netherlands. The Jews excommunicated him because he was pantheistic. Leibniz today would be, you know what he'd be called today? A neo-evangelical. And in one sense, he was like Descartes, perhaps even more so. He went to church. He was Lutheran. He went to church. He didn't spurn the sacraments. He didn't spurn the church. But he created a philosophical system which was just as far deviation from the scriptures as was that of Descartes, although he said that he was sweeping out the dust and correcting Descartes. Note at the bottom of 44, the God of Descartes was essentially what? A product of his own imagination and autonomous reason, and actually depended upon this rationalist for existence. For Descartes to give God a prominent place in his thinking would have been to deny his own rationalism. For this God was neither the creator nor the sustainer of the universe, and was not a personal being who could command to worship, which the God of the Bible requires. Now, Descartes was a covenant breaker. Therefore, he was committed to an essential irrationalism. I did not say, I do not believe that they are not Christians. Now, Descartes gave rise to deism. Spinoza gave rise to modern pantheism and to Hegel. Now, Spinoza's pantheism left man in the state of being totally determined by an impersonal nature. Now, let me pay tribute to Leibniz. He was a man of great ability. He developed both integral and he found time to invent what we think of the first calculating machine. He had a great idea of a world community, of one language, one world, and he was fitted in with the National Council of Churches. Although I would say this in deference to him, he did have an evangelical flavor. As a theologian, he defended the doctrine of Trinity. He also tried to unite the Calvinists and Lutherans. I think existentialism really developed out of John Locke. Not that Locke was an existentialist. Some would say it developed out of Descartes. I think that's a matter strictly of opinion. With the failure of Leibniz to offer satisfactory solutions to serious problems which he had inherited from Descartes and Spinoza, European rationalism runs its course. Note the next sentence. It was out of tune with the scientific temper which characterized the emerging age of Enlightenment. In spite of his devotion to mathematics as an exact science, neither Descartes nor Spinoza nor Leibniz allowed any room in his system for the emerging spirit of scientific investigation. And the philosophy of Leibniz was definitely hostile to the scientific methodology. Now, I said in spite of his devotion to science, what kind of science was he devoted to? The absolute truth which he found in mathematics. This is a very important point. I don't know how many of you have had differential and integral calculus. Have you? Mathematics is an exact science, is not empirically derived. This was the great conviction of Descartes, who did a great deal of work in spherical trigonometry and geometry and so on, and Leibniz. It's an absolute set of absolute truths that no matter whether you can count with your fingers or not, 2 plus 2 equals 4. And you don't have to count with your fingers to prove it. It's by the very nature of the case, it's truism. And it's not derived by a scientific methodology. Now, Leibniz, in spite of all his fondness for science, perceived science in terms of mathematical fixed truth. He did not perceive it in terms of what we call the age of Enlightenment empiricism. I said, I'm speaking of Leibniz, his reliance on innate ideas ruled out the inductive approach to the formulation of knowledge, which is coming to prominence with the scientific revolution then underway. Now, students, from the point of view of Christianity, we reach one of those great climactic eras, which is so important for us to understand. I point out to you, and I have it on this chart, that with the Renaissance, there was a growing divergence between Christian orthodoxy, both Lutheran and Reformed, on the one hand, heading up on that page, and the Renaissance heading down. But I point out to you that no outline can be accurate as to everything. Now, the Reformation on the whole controlled the mind of Northern Europe over the Renaissance from, say, down to 1650, perhaps even 1700. But in the 17th century, the great scientific discoveries of Kepler, and more particularly Newton and Galileo, brought about a whole new intellectual atmosphere in Europe. And the age of rationalism and the insistence upon innate ideas as a source of knowledge was dissipated by the growth of what we call the empirical epistemology and the scientific methodology. This resulted in what we call the Aufklärung, or the Enlightenment. Descartes really had paved the way for it by his insistence that there are two realities in the world, mind and matter. Now he added God as a third reality. I thought it was very courteous of Descartes, through human reason. But you see, God is not necessary to Descartes' philosophy. He could just as well have left him out. So far as his philosophy is concerned, it's probably true of Leibniz, although not quite as true. Spinoza had no place for God, so we don't need to discuss him at that point. In the 17th century, what we call the empirical temper was developing. Now, I'm going to have to explain this to you because it came to its head with John Locke, or to its fruition, I suppose I should say. This is a problem. I use the word rationalism in two senses in this book. One, the basic position of the textbook, which is that of Cornelius Van Til, that the only true rationality is that rationality which perceives all truth through biblical revelation. Now, Christian rationalism, if I might use that term, does not mean the mind of man can achieve truth. But it does mean that the mind of man, the believing, regenerate mind of man, may approach truth as it is in the universe, as it is concerning God, through God's revelation. So that you and I, with regenerate minds, are in a process of knowing God. The rationalism on page 53, I took from the historical point of view. All histories of philosophy divide modern philosophy in this period into rationalism and empiricism. Now, the rationalism of Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz is that philosophical position which holds that all truth resides in the human mind in the form of innate ideas, and that the human mind has all the necessary apparatus to achieve truth without reference to the senses. For instance, Descartes held that the senses only confuse you. That I might see an orange sweater on you, Dwight, and a blue shirt, but I have no way of knowing that that is orange. And my idea of orange is from an innate idea, rather than from seeing an orange sweater or a blue jacket such as Russell has on, or a dotted, it looks like a brown and white from here that you have on, Descartes would say, oh, it confuses you. He would say there's no way to test what you hear except by what you hear. How do you know what you hear is right? You have no way to test what you see but what you see. So how do you know what you see is correct? Now, the empiricism is what we call sensate, sometimes called sensate learning, which, in brief, is this: all you learn through your senses, and you don't learn any other way. And I want to pursue this, but before I do, for you, I want to investigate that opening point, the almost unbounded optimism of the Enlightenment. The mind of Enlightenment, page 54, now had found a new source of authority in a new deity, which had created for itself. And this new deity was natural law. Its prophets were Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and others. In fact, note this: the scientist had become the new high priest, and the test tube, the microscope, the telescope, and mathematics were the source of this new revelation. The new temple was the emerging scientific laboratory. Man would worship God in the scientific laboratory. The high priesthood would gather around the test tube, around the microscope, around the telescope, and would make pronouncements about the Most High because of what it could achieve and find and see. The new infallible rule of faith and practice was the law of nature, natural law. And if you followed natural law, you would have a new millennium. It would arrive shortly through the achievement of its high priest. Now, you can understand this next paragraph, but let's look now. And this is from Condorcet, the Encyclopedia of the French Revolution. Let's look at page 55. Everything tells us that we are approaching the era of one of the grand revolutions of the human race. He wrote this in 1794. What can better enlighten us as to what to expect? What can be a more sure guide to us amidst the commotions than the picture of the revolutions that proceeded and prepared the way for it? The present state of knowledge assures us that it will be happy. In fine, may it not be expected that the human race will be ameliorated by what new discoveries were in the sciences and the arts, humanism and naturalism, and as an unavoidable consequence in the means of individual and general prosperity, by further progress in principal conduct. In other words, as you investigate the laws of nature, what will happen? You'll become better as a race, as individuals. As a moral practice, and lastly, by the improvement of our faculties, moral, intellectual, and physical, which may be the result either of the improvement of the instruments or of our natural organization. Do not all these observations and find, which we propose to develop, prove that the moral goodness of man, the necessary consequence of his organization, is like all their faculties, susceptible of an in-depth improvement, and that nature is connected by a chain which cannot be broken: truth, happiness, and virtue. Now look at that. You open this class period with a series of questions in regard to what's happening now in Iran, Afghanistan, Europe, and this country. And it was a gloomy picture. Very few people today, even liberals, would write of contemporary society in such glowing colors. You take the Nation magazine, you take the New Republic, you take the Atlantic Monthly, Harper's, you take, shall we say, the more thoughtful magazines today. Again and again and again, their pages are laden with titles which are problems. If the word problem does not exist in the title, it floods the content. Liberals today do not write in glowing terms like this: indefinite improvement, no limit, everything will be happy, so on and so on. Now, the men of the Enlightenment believed this. This was not written for the New York Times for popular consumption. This was not written for all that. It was written for one reason. They believed it. Now, he wrote this after the first stages of revolution had been when the French Republic had been established. The August days of 1792 had been carried out. The King Louis XIV, XVI has been executed. And the revolution in France would become the great panacea for all human ills. Students, the French Revolution was tragedies of all history. Nothing glorious about the French Revolution. It brought in an era of revolution from which we're still suffering. France had revolution in 1789, 1793, 1795, 1799, instead that brought in Napoleon. 1818, 1824, 1830, 1848, 1852, 1870, and 1958 they brought in what? Whom? De Gaulle. Every European nation except Great Britain had a revolution in 1848. and it had a movement which was close to a revolution. Some nations had, Belgium had a revolution in 1830, and the history of Europe has been dotted by revolution after revolution. And on a purely empirical level, revolutions have never yielded anything but the fruit from more revolution. And there is no progress like that. But you see, if you go back to the documents surrounding the French Revolution, they believed that was the greatest movement that ever hit the human race, that they had liberated the human race from the dungeon of the past. And Condorcet, who was put to death by guillotine the next year, believed it. Condorcet himself paid the penalty, along with Robespierre, Danton, Marat, and France has never been the same since. Now, the Alps clearing, which the clearing off, the Enlightenment really believed that it was taking away the last clouds hovering over the human vision as it was pushing the curtains back, and Christianity was being pushed off stage, and the mind of reason through science was coming to take the front stage, so to speak. Science would do the trick. Kepler, Galileo, Newton, with their absolutely important discoveries, I'm not arguing that point, had prepared the way for the scientific advance of man. The scientific frame of reference was dealt some lethal blows, and curiously enough, Einstein gave it its death rattle. You see, his concept of relativity, if you really follow its logic, proves that relativity itself is only relative, and therefore the scientific method cannot be depended upon. And if it cannot be depended upon, therefore man can know nothing. Now, someone asked me a little while ago, I believe it was Shirley, what produced existentialism. You can argue that existentialism goes back to Kierkegaard and to John Locke. Now, I would not deny some of the roots there. But the hopelessness of existentialism, I think, emerges out of this whole concept of Einstein's relativity. If you take relativity logically on Locke, he's a graduate engineer, so I'm speaking not only to him but to others, but I think you'll agree. If you strike down any absolutes of any kind in science, there's no science left. You have to have certain formula, you have to have certain engineering principles, you have to have certain equations, which you don't go through every time you do a problem, but you simply accept them as true. The chemist doesn't argue that H2SO4 equals chemistry. I mean, equals sulfuric acid. And even Einstein, what did he do? He created a formula for what? For relativity, didn't he? Now, a formula is supposed to be an absolute to prove there are no absolutes, right? Yes, formula is E equal mc squared. See, the minute you write a formula, you're writing it down not merely for yourself, but for your future students, your future men in science. Well, now, if everything is relative, then E equals mc squared must be relative, and therefore not binding. This enlightenment, this empirical enlightenment, has shifted its base from the absolute foundations of modern science. What has really happened, and I cannot give you an exact date, for I don't know the exact date, but certainly by the 1930s, with John Dewey and others, and increasingly since, psychology and sociology have become the new norms for a new enlightenment in which man no longer looks to science, man no longer looks to fixed laws of a scientific nature, either in physics or chemistry or biology, but he looks within himself. And man, psychologically examined by a Skinner or some other psychologist, becomes the measure of all things. But man is declared to be irrational by Skinner, right? The man has abandoned an objective reality by which he measures himself, and he is measuring himself psychologically. The advance of that is, when you continue to do this, you come to the existentialist position that there's no reality. Because if there's no objective reality, how in the world can you be sure that you're real? And so the existentialist has come the next step to deny any objective truth and any internal truth. And so the modern world, the modern unbelieving world, is grasping and crying out, who am I? Which is a logical question. They have no other place to go. It's the end of line, which is depicted by Arthur Miller in The Death of a Salesman, modern rock and roll, Elvis Presley, oh, I could name so many, Hinduism music, modern religious jazz, or Christianized rock and roll, political life. The dictatorship is the natural result of a man who has lost his own identity as a nation, as a person. And man living in society, in spite of his denunciation of himself, has to have some objective authority. And so they erect a sovereign totalitarian state. And this is where modern psychology, modern sociology, modern education, and all the other modern elements are driving us today. The higher your theology, the more opposition it will meet. The central core of the Reformation, whether it be Luther or Calvin, Wies or Cranmer, is that God is sovereign, man is totally a slave. He is to sin. He is totally depraved. Now that's not a popular message. And the scientific discoveries seem to belie this concept of sovereignty of God. I mean, look at what Newton has discovered. Look at Kepler with his mathematical evaluation of the eclipses and so on. Great mind, no question. Happened to be a believer, however. Kepler and Galileo. Galileo was a believer. Newton was a believer. But because they were believers, this is the irony of the situation, because they were believers and regenerate covenant breakers, God led them into tremendous insight in the nature of our universe, the movement of the stars, the planets, the law of gravity, and by no means did Newton confine himself to that. But he was a great scientist in his day. Now you see, God was pleased in the 18th century and the 17th century to reveal himself through his chosen elect and give them great minds for scholarship, particularly the sciences. Their discovery blinded the modern world to the God behind them who made them possible. And so the dazzling conquest of nature, and I'm thinking of Boyle and the others, Huygens and the others who made real discoveries, it came like a burst all of a sudden upon the European mind. And it blinded them to the truth of the gospel. Because man can now prove his sovereignty. Man's sovereign. We have a new high priesthood. We have a new revelation, natural law. We have a new sacrament. The test tube, the microscope, the telescope. They're the sacraments by which we communicate with truth and receive the benefits of truth. That's the answer. The churches at that time remained true. Now, unbelief grew up within them. Church of England, yes. And there was what we call Lutheran scholasticism, the Lutheran church. On the whole, the Presbyterian churches remained very, very vigorous. At the end, in 1685, the Huguenots were driven out of France and the Palatinate by Louis XIV. And that's how my family got here. We were German Huguenots out of the Palatinate. And somewhere around 1690, they had to flee for laude. The number varies, but scholars would admit about 2 million Frenchmen were put to death. An English historian said that enough Huguenot blood was shed in France to float a battleship. It means quite a bit of blood. And they came to this country. And the church remained amazingly strong. However, in the Protestant countries, there was no political hand to compel belief, where we had the free churches. So, in France, the papacy and the monarchy together in the 17th, 18th centuries compelled belief until the Revolution. In Italy, the same thing was true. In Spain, the same thing was true. In Portugal, the same thing was true. In southern Germany, it was true to an extent, although not as much so. In Hungary, it was sharply divided between the Roman Catholics and the Calvinists. Austria, strictly Catholic, so on. Switzerland, mostly Protestant. But in these areas where Protestantism had brought the great blessing of scientific discovery, it proved to be the means by which man would once again assert his own sovereignty, his own lack of need for God who controlled him. He would have a nature whom he could control. The first fallacy is that nobody has said Christ died for certain few. So I would raise an objection at that point.